am Alex.
And I'm Shane.
And this is the RPM podcast.
And welcome back to another podcast. And this time it's an RPM Roundup, the first one of 2021. And it's a bit of a spicy one. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this, Alex. So at the time of recording, the F1 Commission, in conjunction with the FIA, Liberty Media, and all 10 teams, are due to vote on a new plan to test a sprint race that would replace Saturday's qualifying at 3 events in 2021. And we're here to talk about all the details we know, when they're due to vote, what the likely outcome's going to be, and what our thoughts and opinions are about the whole concept. So over to you, Alex.
Right, let's jump straight in and talk about what are the proposals? What are the proposals themselves? So they're going to introduce an approximately 100-kilometre sprint race, or a one-third distance race, that would be run on Saturdays, have its starting grid decided by a qualifying session on Friday, which would replace FP2, and the sprint race would then determine the grid for the full race on Sunday. And points, although the details on this aren't known at the moment, we are only aware from the statement by Stefano Domenicali himself that the points would be awarded to the top 8 drivers at a reduced amount for the sprint race, but we don't know how much yet. There's some speculation that it could be half, but nobody knows is the answer. Currently, it's being proposed to test this format in Canada, Italy, and Brazil as part of the 2021 calendar, like you mentioned. And of course, this comes after recent proposals to trial reverse grids in Formula One, which was ultimately vetoed by Mercedes. So that's the plans. That's the general idea. Introduce a sprint race and have it have an impact on the starting grid for Sunday, and have qualifying itself moved to Friday, and all of this for 3 races as a trial run in the 2021 calendar. Shane, what do you think this is likely to? What impact do you think this could have if introduced?
Well,
what do you think of this idea?
There's definitely positives and negatives to take away from the proposal, like there is with everything. Some positive news for the fans, because that encourages people to go to a Friday instead of a Saturday or Sunday. Friday generally being the cheaper option for fans. So actually that would encourage more people to go for the Friday, which I think would make it more interesting, because you're going to get a traditional qualifying session on a Friday with limited running. And whenever we've had limited running on a normal Friday, that's made qualifying very interesting. So I think it's going to be great for the fans. Obviously, the sponsors and, Liberty Media will be making a lot more money out of it, because more cars on track, the more viewership. Yeah. Will I think it will benefit the teams? We've got to remember there's a cost cap coming into this year, or has been introduced this year, where teams have got to manage the whole season under a certain amount of budget. Now, from what I've read, the teams are going to be given an extra £55,000 per sprint race to cover the costs. However, it's key to remember that actually, if a front wing goes missing or gets broken, that's a £200,000 deficit. So we're in an era where we're trying to save as much money as possible to make the sport more accessible for different teams and new teams, but we've introduced a race which potentially could cost hundreds of thousands worth of pounds. And that's just looking at one aspect of it. You can look at it from any direction. There's definitely loads of pros and cons. What sticks out for you?
Yeah, obviously what you said is a big one. A race means higher chance of damage to the car and requires more spares, greater cost to the teams. Does seem a little counterproductive given the cost cap. Also, I think I can't help but feel that it kind of devalues an actual Grand Prix win to some extent.
I couldn't agree more.
It's winning a Grand Prix is a very big deal in Formula One, and not only does having the 2 races kind of, like I say, slightly devalue the full race ranks, but it also takes away some of the kind of big event atmosphere that comes from a Sunday race. And it's unclear whether we should consider a sprint race win to be the same as a full race win when we talk about a driver's career.
Will they be a Grand Prix winner?
Yeah, is that the same thing?
Or will they just be a sprint race
points, winner? Exactly, yeah. If they're awarded fewer points and are only completing a third standard race difference, then it's really only 1/3 of a F1 Grand Prix win. So do you have to win 3 to be considered a full Grand Prix winner? It's that's a silly way of looking at it, but it's it is a little bit mysterious as to how we should regard that and how people will feel about it if it is introduced, because it does change the nature of what it means to be a Grand Prix winner. And that's a big deal in Formula One, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, it's great for the fans. The fans want more on-track action. They want more. They want to sit down and watch more Formula One. So there's no negative impact for the fans, but for the teams and for the sports itself, like you said, will it devalue the impact of a Sunday race, the Grand Prix race? Will that mean less, given that potentially points were awarded on a Saturday?
It does give them a greater opportunity for perhaps less hardcore fans to tune in and watch it as well. Because one of the biggest complaints I hear from people who don't watch Formula One or perhaps put off it from some way, a lot of them complain that the races are very long and like it takes up the whole weekend. And I mean, the argument of the races being long is complete rubbish, because, you know, generally speaking, a race doesn't take much longer than, say, a football match or a rugby match or something. And a Formula One race doesn't have a pause in the middle unless there's a red flag. So that's, you know, but perceptions matter. If the perception is that the races are quite long, then introducing a sprint race might be a kind of easy way of getting people into it and saying, well, here's a shorter version, you know, going for a quick sprint instead. So it does have that possibility. It provides more value for the sponsors and for the promoters who are potentially getting fresh eyes on a shorter race instead. But there's no guarantee it will provide better racing or even good racing.
No,
because
I agree.
There's a risk that the lower down teams might be prepared to take risks to put themselves higher up the order. So if you think like what Haas did at Hungary, where they went onto the different tyres and ended up, and at one point I think Magnussen was like third in that race. Yep. Now, in a shorter race, he's more likely to keep a higher up position because you don't have the full length attrition of a race where the better cars tend to very slowly work their way towards the top, and somebody who's perhaps out-qualified or outperformed their machinery in qualifying starts slowly slipping back, like Leclerc did in most of 2020.
I was going to say, it's a very...
put in a banging lap and then slowly slip down the grid.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting point, because Leclerc cropped up in my mind how he outperformed that car so much last year, but then over the course of 90 minutes or 50 laps, he couldn't do anything more with that car. But actually, if it was only a 30-minute race, or whether it was, you know, however long, he's got a better chance of staying up in that top field. It makes qualifying all more important. I read something online. This is a very interesting point, and I want to get your opinion on it. Sunday is all about strategy as much as it is racing. Obviously, a lot of it comes down to the strategy, and a lot of the strategy is determined by tyre wear. Do you think running a race the day before would give too much data now to the race engineers to make it even more of a predictable race on a Sunday? If we're running a 1/3 lap or 1/3 of the race the day before, admittedly at a slightly different time, but we'll probably use the same tyre compounds, are we just giving more data to the race engineers so we can have an even more predictable Sunday outcome?
Yeah, that is a good point. If you run a short race, you get lots of data on the tires, and I'm not sure exactly how they would get the changer of the tires to work. Obviously, at the moment, it's what you're running in qualifying. You start on. I don't know exactly how they would alter that, and we don't know yet. Not at all revealed exactly what the proposals on that are. But yeah, it's a good point. More data means potentially more predictable. We see what happens with Spain. They go around that track so many times they can basically simulate the race. So and you can't account for obviously the occasional random errors. It's obviously no replacement for the real thing, but it brings us closer and closer to a potential simulation. That's an interesting point and adds to my overall concerns. Just to throw something in your direction to see what you think. What about the idea that it kind of changes the nature of a strong single lap performance under Friday qualifying? Because we mentioned briefly about people who outperform their machinery, but if you have somebody who regularly outperforms their machinery like Leclerc, or otherwise excels during qualifying sessions like someone like Russell, who is Mr. Saturday, he's generally known for his strong Saturday performances, and it puts them into a stronger position into the sprint race to could potentially then gain points in the full race as well.
Yeah.
But over the course of a full race, we'd expect them to lose positions. But in a sprint race, they might hold their position. But if then the sprint race determines the grid for the full race as well, over full amount of points that they could gain, they might actually lose out in the long run.
Yeah, true.
Because they do a Good Friday session, and they end. Let's say Leclerc qualifies 4th or something for the sprint race, and then he falls back to 6th or 7th. It means that the full hoard of points that he could have got means he's started lower down for the full race. And so the maximum number of points he could have got in total could go down overall.
Interesting.
He'll get some points from the sprint race, but fewer from the full race.
You make a very good point, because actually, if this was a traditional weekend, he may have qualified 4th, which would have been fantastic for Ferrari last year, and would be in a better opportunity to be scoring full points. But what you're saying is, if they then have to do a race to determine the starting grid, it's almost he's on a double back footer. He has to perform twice to get those points. Very interesting. This is where it would work for some teams and where it won't work for other teams. It would benefit Williams, where they might be able to clutch an opportunity which may have not been in reach in a traditional qualifying session. But for teams like Ferrari, where they have to, where their cars on a one lap basis are very good, but over a race aren't, would really penalise them. It's a very interesting point.
But a team like Williams would actually be hurt even more in the full race as well. Because let's say Russell puts in another great qualifying performance and starts, gets into Q2, starts P15 or something. In the sprint race, he's in a better position to maybe gain some positions. If somebody crashes out, he might find himself in 10th and finish the race because it finishes earlier as a result of the shorter distance. But he might also find himself more likely in a position where he starts to slip down the order, as we have seen happen again if he outperforms his machinery. And then he just starts in an even worse place for the full-length race.
Very true. I think it all depends on how the teams would approach the race weekend or the sprint race. Would they try and be conservative and conserve the parts, try and keep it clean and maintain that position, which I imagine Red Bull would maybe try and do with 2 drivers maybe finishing 3rd and 4th. That might be their goal. But teams which have got a lot more to gain, Haas, Williams, Alfa Romeo, might be running their machinery at such a higher efficiency to try and get those extra positions for that full-length race. I can understand why it's being considered, because there's so many variables, and what we know about Formula One is actually the more variables, the more interesting of a race we usually end up having. But it could end up hindering some people, which brings me on to something I learned today, is how this actually gets passed. So there are 30 votes in consideration from the team, the FIA, and Liberty Media. Now, 28 of those votes have to agree on these new set of rules for it to be passed into 2021. Now, Alex, do you think there will be 28 votes in favour of these new rules? Just thinking at the teams, say all the sponsors, so the FIA and the Liberty Media, all agree on these rules. That leaves 10 votes. Can you imagine 8 teams agreeing on these rules straight off?
Yeah, it's very rare that everyone in the room agrees in Formula One. Well, I don't know. I would be surprised if this passes, I think. What I have heard is Toto Wolff has been quoted as being slightly more approving of the idea than they were with reverse grids. I think reverse grids was a non-starter. I think that's a terrible idea, personally. So I'm glad that never went any further. I'm also pretty put off by this idea myself. I'd much rather see the impact of the new technical regulations and the cost cap and the changes to the regulations, like how much wind tunnel time they get and all this sort of stuff. I'd rather see the impact of that before altering the race format in this kind of way. And although the current proposal is only a trial, we have seen these kind of things being agreed in the past. So it's possible that it will get passed and get all those votes. We haven't heard anyone being super against it so far that I'm aware of.
It's a lot more favourable than reverse grids. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think I would still be kind of surprised though. I'm not sure it's a pretty big change to be making when they're already undergoing all these other changes.
Absolutely.
I think they're trying to throw too much at it, throwing too many things at once.
Like you said, if anything, I think let the new regulations settle in, see what impact they have. And my instant thing, if I had to choose one thing to change about the Formula One weekend, would be to knock off one of the practice sessions. Just knock off a half
Well, they
an
have
hour.
made them shorter, haven't they?
Yeah.
They made them shorter for the season.
Just knock off a whole practice session. Limited running has always proved to be interesting on qualifying and both the race. And by knocking off a practice session, you're saving money, you're saving parts. It's part of the cost-saving effort. I think that's the way forward. But I agree with you. I'd be very surprised if 28 out of 30 parties agree on these new rules. It would honestly shock me.
Yeah. It's but it has happened before, of course, and this is actually the first time it would be, if it does pass, it would be officially a trial, because in the past Formula One have just introduced whole changes and then had to go back on them, like
the elimination qualifying.
Yeah, they had the elimination thing. That was like 2016. It was like every 90 seconds a driver gets eliminated, and you could kind of see where the idea was coming from. But what actually happened is that the results were decided like long before the actual flag, and it just wasn't that exciting. And
it was,
and the aggregate qualifying system. Remember that, where you had to like combine 2 laps and you get like an aggregate result that lasted just 6 races in 2005. So yeah, it's not the right kind of tinkering. And like I say, I'd be much happier to see the changes with the current regulation go through first. So yeah, I'm not particularly enthused by this idea. I can see the logic behind it. And I can see them wanting to try and increase the value for the sponsors and increase the value for the promoters, and to also get newer fans into the sport by watching this kind of quicker race. But I don't know. Then I feel like you might say something like, oh, well, they could just have an exhibition race. But then if it's an exhibition race, they don't take it very seriously. And
also, without points on the table, or if it's an expedition race, they don't want to be using the same machinery they're going to be using to compete with in a world championship. There has to be a reason for that team to run that car. There has to be some kind of benefit. And they won't do it just for the fans. Unfortunately, they won't run the Mercedes won't run a 300-kilometer race just for the fans and use up, almost a race weekend engine. So
exactly, and then it all comes back to costs, doesn't it? It all comes back to how much it costs the team, and the fact that a team like Mercedes or Ferrari or whatever, they can potentially afford to bear the brunt of that and to take the risk, and they're already the ones that are performing at that top level. Team like Williams or Haas, Alfa Romeo, whoever, they maybe don't have the same level of resources and thus are not in a position to take as much risk, even though they're the very ones that should be taking the maximum possible risk.
Absolutely.
In order to improve their situation.
Yep.
It just comes down to that. So
and we've been
show me the cost cap, show me the other changes first.
We've been going around in circles for a couple of years with Formula One now, trying to introduce different ideas and then being vetoed. And I'm a strong believer that we should just wait for, let's see what the 2021 season brings us with an introduction of a cost cap and slightly shorter running times, etc. And then we'll wait for 2022 and then maybe look at altering the race weekend. But let's not do it when we're on the cusp of all these new regulations, these things which have been put in place over years of planning. Let's not just try and chuck something new in just because it might make something work for a couple of races. Let's just believe in the system, believe that what they've done will work, and just see what happens.
Yeah, I'm prepared to take the same kind of attitude, I guess, to this idea if it is only a trial. But I think the precedent that's been set is that it will be probably a bit of a mess if it does go ahead, or it may not be as exciting as everyone hopes, and we just end up with going back to the original format, and so it might just prove to be a bit of a waste of time.
Well, there we have it, the first RPM roundup of 2021, and it's all about the potential of there being some sprint races going into this season. If you're listening and watching us on YouTube, please be sure to give the channel and video a like and subscribe so you can keep up to date with all what we do. If you're listening to us on your podcast app, please be sure to give us a thumbs up or a 5-star and leave us a review if you want. It lets us know what you think about the podcast and what we can do to improve it. If you haven't done already, please be sure to follow us on Twitter at RacePerMinute. We're constantly uploading polls, footage, gaming footage, just anything to do with Formula One. It goes on that Twitter. We've got a great little community going at the moment, and it'd be a shame for you guys to miss out. So be sure to follow us on Twitter. If you have any questions and you want to, say, video yourself or send us an audio clip of your question, then you can do by emailing us at info@raceperminute.com. and you might get featured on a upcoming podcast in a segment what we call View from the Stands. And if you really like what we do and you want to show us how much you love the podcast, then you can support us on Patreon by going to patreon.com/RacePerMinute, and you can donate as little as £1 a month to help support Alex and I keep on going with this podcast. That's all from us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.